Well, let's get practical with what a plate could look like, given the macros you've been discussing. We want to bring down the carbs, moderate protein, and high fat.
Well,
But
yeah.
the
So
part I
enough
just
fat,
want to
to
clarify
be,
before you jump in
yeah.
here, a lot of people who eat in a similar way say high protein is the way to go. And what I want to hone in on here is the protein piece, moderate. Because when you start really bringing the animal foods in,
Hmm.
naturally you're going to bring in fats and proteins. But how do you do it in a way to maintain those macros the way you stated them?
Yeah. So I don't put a lot of thought or obsession into the macros, other than because I'm accustomed, I guess, to eating the way I do. But um, so um, so something, one of the things that is kind of important to, well, for instance, a breakfast for me might look like I raise ducks for their eggs, and so a lovely duck egg, which are nutritionally vastly superior to chicken eggs, and I think they taste better. But I have an immune reactivity to chicken eggs anyway, but I prefer duck eggs in any case. And maybe a couple pieces of uh, a beautiful, pastured, thick cut pastured bacon or something like that, just as an example. And then maybe some sliced cucumbers, from my garden, with a little vinaigrette on there of some sort, or some sliced tomatoes, which are fresh right now. Um, and I mean, there you have it. Calorically speaking, in that on that plate, the predominant calories are really going to come from the fats on that plate. Again, protein supplies half the caloric value that fats do, and carbohydrates. Well, cucumber isn't giving you much of anything calorically, um, and so that would be an example, for instance. So, um, so when I started out on this sojourn of figuring out not just what did humans eat and how did we evolve and all of that, because I asked myself a whole bunch of questions along the way. It's like, well, just because a, an ancient human was able to pick something up wherever, stick it in their mouths, chew it up, and swallow it, that that we shouldn't just automatically assume that that food was optimal for them any more than it might be optimal for us right now. So how do we know? One of the cool things Weston Price did that I really appreciated, and very few of his devotees actually appreciate, is that, of course, he traveled over a course of 10 years, over 100,000 miles around the planet, and he studied the so many indigenous cultures and traditional cultures around the world that were still thriving on dietary practices that they'd been exercising for hundreds or even thousands of years. And um, and we're talking about the Aborigines in Australia. We're talking about the Inuit in the high Arctic. We're talking about Native North American tribes. We're talking about South American people groups, people in Africa, people in the remote Loschental Valley in Switzerland, people in the Outer Hebrides Islands, and all these places. And obviously, those diets are all going to look really different from each other. And he examined the health of all these people groups and found that, yes, when they were exercising their traditional diets, etc., their ancient diets, um, they seemed to have extraordinary health and freedom from disease, and they had excellent skeletal structure, excellent dental health, excellent everything. Mental health was a big one. But what he asked himself was, out of all of the healthiest people that I studied, what dietary elements that they all have in common? And he found there were two things that were of primary importance. Number one, they all consumed as many animal source foods as were available to them. In other words, he looked all over the world to try to find a vegan culture. He thought for sure had to be one out there somewhere. He never found one. He was quite disappointed about that. Um, but secondly, the most important foods, the most sacred foods, the most venerated foods in all instances of optimal health were those that were highest in fat and fat-soluble nutrients, largely animal fat. And therein, in my mind, lies a foundational basis anyway for the fundamental nutritional requirements of every human being alive. And another pet peeve of mine, I've got a list, but another pet peeve of mine is the idea of like, you hear the term all the time at conferences and lectures and whatever else, and they say bio-individuality. Oh, it's all about bio-individuality. One a diet that's right for one isn't right for some. Look, what makes us human, intrinsically human, are not our differences. It's those things we share in common. We all have the same basic, type of brain and nervous system. We have the same, type of endocrine system, immune function, etc. We all have a blood pH range that needs to run somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45 to be healthy or else. Um, you know, and we all require roughly the same range of nutrients on a foundational basis in order to be optimally healthy. Now, from there, yes, there are individuals that can't tolerate this or that or the other thing. I consider what mostly gets termed by bio-individuality as nuance. Look, we may all, have unique, little fingerprints, but we all have fingers, and we are, um, we all have the same foundational nutritional requirements, and there is nobody alive for whom a vegan diet is an optimal way of eating. There are people that can get away with it for periods of time, and I have the references for what I'm about to say, but it's anywhere from 75 to 84% of all vegans within 10 years have abandoned that way of eating, and almost always due to health-related issues. Um, and so, we're not designed that way. You're not a cow, you're not a rabbit, you're not a deer or a goat or anything like that, or even a chimp for that matter. And, a chimpanzee's brain hasn't changed appreciably in, like 4 million years. Um, and why is that? Why is theirs not changed and ours has? Well, because they're still, swinging from the vines and eating their leaves and bananas. And we had an early ancestor that found a compelling need, probably as a result of some catastrophic change, a geological time uh, period in which there were cataclysms or whatever else. There was some catastrophic change that forced us to look at things differently. It forced us to reach for something different. And once we began, even Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, was the earliest hominid skeleton. I believe they've since found ones that are even earlier, but she was originally believed to have been a vegan animal, and they've since found, well, no, they actually used stone tools to cleave meat and marrow from bone. Once we began doing that and we began energizing ourselves in that manner, we began developing fairly rapid encephalization, which is, in other words, brain growth. And once, we got about 2 million years ago, Homo erectus was the first of our ancestors that had a full-time hunting economy. And from there, the brain size just exploded. I think it probably reached its zenith about 20,000 years ago with Cro-Magnon humans. Our brains were about 20% bigger then than they are now. But we've lost about 11% of our brain volume just in the last 10,000 years where we adopted agriculture and began relying on these commodities and whatever as primary source of so-called nourishment. And that's where we began developing the early forms of what we started calling the diseases of civilization. So, the cultivation of grains allowed us to, not have to roam around so much and rely on hunting as much. It allowed us to concentrate our populations more and store food for longer periods of time, which also gave us, nation states and and all kinds of things that arose from there, and perpetual war to protect those stores. Um, but it isn't really how we evolved, and so part of my thing is that so I was going to talk about the fact that just because we chewed something up, swallowed it, and whatever, and then Price asked himself those questions. But I wanted to look at, how do we know what's actually optimal, and even in terms of macronutrients? And looking at longevity and anti-aging research provided those clues. And it turns out that in one of the common elements in all centenarian, for instance, humans, um, are very low insulin levels and very, low manageable glucose levels. Um, Really, the less insulin you require in the course of your lifetime, the longer you're going to live and the healthier you are going to be by far. Insulin isn't exactly a blood sugar hormone. It is actually really more about coordinating our energy stores with reproduction and lifespan. It is about taking excess nutrients and putting them into storage for later use, in case of a famine or whatever else. But of the three major macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, the only one for which there is no established human dietary requirement, not in any textbook of physiology anywhere, is carbohydrate. We can manufacture all the glucose we actually require from a combination of protein and fat in the diet. Better to get it mostly from fat. Um, and um, and so when we have, roughly the average person who relies on glucose has roughly 5 grams of glucose floating around in their bloodstream at any given moment. You consume something that's got 10 grams of carbs, now you've doubled that. And your body goes, because your body's obsessed with maintaining the lowest level glucose necessary, because glucose is intrinsically damaging. It attaches itself to proteins and fats and causes them to become glycated. In other words, kind of gummed up and misshapen and whatnot. And that is a major part of how we age, is through glycation and cross-linking of proteins and things like that, which is a function of glucose largely. Um, and so when we have too much glucose going into our bloodstream at one time, insulin activates to take those excess nutrients out of the bloodstream quickly. It's been erroneously identified as a blood sugar hormone when in fact that really isn't what it is, but it gets used that way for people, particularly those relying on sugars and starches in their daily diets. So, um, but it's interesting to point out that even yeast generates insulin, and it's the same molecule. And yeast don't have blood sugar, So it's this very ancient molecule that just has this adaptive purpose, that allows us to survive a famine or whatever else, or helps us store excess nutrients, like some of our more Neolithic ancestors, would have probably consumed in more temperate regions where it was available. They might have consumed a lot of fruit in late summer, or whatever, and gone into a little bit of insulin resistance. That served an adaptive response to upcoming harsh conditions, right? In winter, where food is much more scarce, if you can put on a layer of ballast, if you will, a layer of extra fuel, that might give you a little bit of an edge in terms of survival through the winter months. So, you know, we're so far removed from the natural environment in which we evolved that people just don't really have a grasp of any of these things. Um, and the thing is like, um, insulin resistance once upon a time was served a useful purpose, perhaps for some people during certain times of the year. But nowadays, I don't care if you're living in Minnesota or you're living in Florida or Cabo or wherever, you know, we're all inside where it's roughly 72 degrees, all day long. And so winter ain't coming for us anymore the way it once did. And yet we have this unnatural access to this unnatural abundance of food and food-like substances. And when you are relying on blood sugar as a primary source of fuel, uh, empty calories seem to serve just fine for that, you know, for that addiction. Um, Most of us don't have to take more than 2 steps to be able to grab a handful of something we think of as food and throw it in our mouths and eat it. Our ancestors didn't have that. So, all of those things that were part of the selective pressures that shaped us are now, um, have now kind of started working against us, right? The ways in which our bodies reacted to our environment once upon a time are now working against a lot of people. Um, so what you generally find when you're eating the way I'm talking about is that eating becomes more of a choice as opposed to a necessity, right? You find that you forget to eat actually. And the other peeve I have, another one on the list, is the excessive emphasis upon what is what is thought of as fasting. Um, and there are a number of reasons why I have an issue with it. Partly because one of the things I wanted to take into account, for instance, when I came up with the approach I did, were the unique selective pressures, shall we say, and circumstances and and issues that we are facing today as a species that our ancient ancestors couldn't have even begun to conceive of. And we have ever since World War II, our topsoil, we've lost about 60% of our topsoil, which also means we've lost about 60% of the nutritional value of the foods that we grow and that are fed to animals that we eat oftentimes. And so we have, number one, less nutrient value in the foods that most people are consuming, and which makes it harder to meet your nutritional requirements to make you resilient and make you optimally healthy and have great immune function, etc. And that's part of the problem. Um, but also because we are living in such unprecedentedly high stress times, I think by design, right? Every single newscast or whatever it is that you want to look at, wherever you get, whether it's through mainstream legacy media or even, even some of the better alternative media, most things are very alarmist. Everything's kind of, designed to, um, um, trigger a stress response. And when you're in that state of what, I worked with the brain for over 20 years in clinical practice, and we have our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. Most people that I worked with during the years of my practice were just overwhelmingly marinated in sympathetic overarousal, right? Which manifests as anxiety and stress and an inability to sleep. And digestion is a parasympathetic process. We have to be in a calm, relaxed state in order for because digestion starts in the brain, actually, not the stomach. You know, we're hopefully relaxed. We begin to detect the aromas of certain foods and whatever else that triggers then brain chemicals that then stimulate the release of certain substances that stimulate gastric, pH and hydrochloric acid production. And then it's all a north to south process. And the pH of our stomachs is really, really important. And stomach is an acid organ. It needs to be. It's almost pure acid in there. Most people don't suffer from too much hydrochloric acid. They suffer from not enough. And if you are in sympathetic overarousal, you're in a fight or flight state. You're being chased by a cantankerous woolly mammoth, or an ugly date or whatever. You know, that adrenaline shuts down all of that, and everything goes to fueling your muscles, and you're getting that blood sugar jacked up so that you have the rocket fuel to outrun whatever it is you're trying to get away from, metaphorically or literally. And so most people have crappy digestion as a result. So not only are the nutrients we're consuming less, but our ability to extract those nutrients and make optimal use of them, can be less. And now you're going to fast. Fasting is not a nutritional strategy. Now, I'm not altogether opposed to people who say want to do that intermittent fasting where they're just eating within a certain window of time in the middle of the day. I get that. And that's fine, except that what's really important is that you're getting all your nutritional requirements met in that window, and that you're eating, the most nutrient dense foods possible in that window. The beauty of the approach that I've developed is that you get all of the benefits of fasting without the downside. You're not hungry. You're moderating your protein. So one of the reasons fasting's so beneficial, so the reason I advocate for protein moderation is that there's a metabolic pathway that was discovered by, people doing longevity studies, and actually they were doing other kinds of studies, but they discovered this pathway called mTOR, which stands for mammalian target of rapamycin. And they found that it gets activated by an excess of protein. And again, this is like insulin. It's about coordination of energy stores with reproduction and lifespan. So if you consume just say a ginormous steak or something like that, anything over about 4 ounces or so of that steak is likely to trigger an mTOR response. And what that says is, wow, we've got tremendous nutrient abundance right now. This is a good time to make a bunch of new cells. It stimulates cellular proliferation. Well, if you're a baby, a child, a teen, pregnant or lactating or whatever, that may make sense, and your protein requirements may be is slightly higher because of that. But if instead you consume just what you need, protein-wise in a meal, and I have a calculation for that I provide, in my book and whatnot, but that you can help you figure out roughly what that optimal amount for you is based on your estimated ideal body weight and that kind of thing. A lot of people use lean tissue mass, but who's going to go and get that testing done? Nobody. So most people think of themselves as having been their best, had their most optimal when they were their leanest. So we'll just choose, we choose that as kind of a general thing. But when you consume just what you need in order to maintain your body mass and your fundamental protein requirements, but you don't exceed that, to put it in modern day economic terms, it's like saying, well, honey, it's too expensive to build a new home right now, so let's fix up the one we've got. And that's what your body sets about doing. Goes into autophagy. It starts to go into detoxification mode. It starts to go into cellular repair mode. I mean, what's getting repaired is you. Rather than taking the damaged cells, ignoring them, and just making a bunch of new cells, your body instead turns around and focuses on your own healthiest maintenance and repair. That is some of the benefit that is gotten from fasting. But the problem in that is that for people that are accustomed, especially people who are accustomed to relying on sugar as a primary source of fuel and are using fasting as a way to kind of, forgive that sin or get around it, it's a roller coaster ride, and the effects of intermittent fasting are intermittent, rather than full time like they could be. And then you don't have to be hungry, and you don't have to be depriving yourself all the time. When you are and it can take a few months to become fully adapted to relying on ketones as a primary source of fuel. It is a process. This isn't something that flips back and forth in any efficient manner whatsoever when people are doing their fasts and whatever else. Yes, you'll start producing a lot of ketones when you stop eating sugar. Doesn't mean your body's efficient at making use of them. And it doesn't mean you're not going to have a whole bunch of cravings for that rocket fuel that you were dependent upon. And so um it's a it's a struggle, and it's really uncomfortable for a lot of people that are relying on blood sugar. You know, uh, when you are reliant instead, you have a full-time reliance on ketones as your main source of fuel. Again, you just aren't hungry. I mean, eating you make so you're able to make better decisions, right, about what you eat when you eat. It's not like, oh my God, I'm going to chew somebody's arm off. Oh, there's a bag of chips, thank God, and whatever else. You're able to kind of pick and choose, and you're clear-headed about it. Nowadays, people aren't more than 1 or 2 missed meals, most people, from a state of total emotional and metabolic chaos. And, people get crazy really fast when the grocery store shelves go empty. I can, I'll tell you a story about something I did that I don't recommend anyone else do. Um, it was something I had a curiosity, and I just thought, I'm just really curious about this. And so I was already ketogenically very well adapted, and I decided to see how long I could go without eating and what that would do. And I was measuring my ketones and glucose levels and all that kind of stuff, whatever. But it was actually a seamless thing for me because I didn't go through, withdrawal. I didn't go through, the blood sugar crashes and whatever the people go through when they try to fast, and it just gets really uncomfortable really fast. I just didn't have that. It was fine because I was already most people have 100,000 calories or more of extra, fat on their bodies that they can draw from to make more ketones. So you don't have to be eating to make them. Um, and I will tell you in all honesty, well, it's not like hunger wasn't a big deal during that time. It was kind of like a scratch I couldn't itch, a little bit, or itch I couldn't scratch rather. Um, the thing is, as humans, food is such a major part of the way we engage socially, and it's such a major part of what we derive pleasure from. It was a bummer. It was just kind of a bummer. And I'd wake up in the morning and think, okay, what should I make for break? Oh, darn. Oh, I'm not eating right now. Shoot. So um, it cut into my social interaction and all that kind of a thing. It was interesting all the ways in which not eating was impactful on different levels, but energy wise, mental clarity wise, I was doing just as well on day. I went 21 days without eating anything. I was, and it was the same on day 21 that it was on day 1 for me. Now, I'm not saying that was a healthy thing for me to do at all because I knew that it's like, okay, me and Gandhi, 21 days, cool. I'm going back to eating again because, I probably deprived my body of a lot of nutrients during that time. It's not just about calories, right? It's about nutrition. And so it wasn't a healthy thing to do, but it was a very interesting exercise. And it is definitely, uh, it is an excellent adaptation for survival because if you're in a situation where things are chaotic or, food isn't available or whatever else, you need clear thinking in order to sort your circumstances out and figure out what you're going to do next and where you're going to find the food. And then you have to have the energy necessary to go out and find that food. And if you're dependent on sugar when that happens, you just kind of go crazy. Um, or you just crash and can't function, or a little of both. And so I just, when you want to talk about a nutrition for a new economy, um, there's a lot to be said for this approach. The other interesting thing to point out, um, I have this dear friend, her name's Carolyn Rush. We've known each other for a very long time, and she was a vegan for a long time, and then, one of the things she was obsessed with, um, because her mom was a single mom and had all these kids, so they were very frugal, and her mom, subscribed to a publication called the Tightwad Gazette that used to exist. That it doesn't exist anymore, I don't think, but she it was kinda devoted to making the most of every dollar. How do you know how can you make the most of how can you save money on everything? How can you stretch things out and live on a minimal budget? And, how do you make use of that empty toilet paper rolls? Whatever it is. And it became kinda like a game for her. She became really expert. She had all of the issues. She memorized practically everything in them, and she wanted to learn. It was a game for her. How cheaply can I live? And then what she could make, I mean, she was, maybe making, I don't know, when she was a massage therapist, making not that much money, but she paid for her own home in cash, and all that kind of stuff. So she isn't opposed to, Carolyn would say, I'm not opposed to spending money, I'm opposed to wasting money. She's a heck of a lot more fun to hang out with than you might think, actually. You just don't go out to restaurants much. But she came out to visit me. Oh, and so once I wrote my first book, Primal Body, Primal Mind, she read that and said, "Wow, okay, you've convinced me." She says, "Yeah, I need to stop this vegan thing." So she began adopting that way of doing things, and then she came out west when I was living in Portland. She came to visit, and we were hanging out in the kitchen one morning and eating breakfast, and she's like, "Man, this is so good. This is, I feel like I'm getting away with something." And you do sometimes feel like you're getting away with stuff eating this way. It just seems decadently delicious. Um, she says, this is actually the cheapest way of eating optimally well I've ever discovered." And I went, "What?" And I did not expect her to say that. I would not have said that. Um, I would have said, well, because the way of eating we're talking about completely uncompromising sources of food, 100% organic, preferably organic in the way that you have a firsthand knowing of where that food was grown, how it was grown, and it's fresh and locally available and all that kind of thing, and only the meat of animals that have been allowed to live a life that's natural to them, right? Because the health of the meat or fat you eat directly correlates to the health of the animal that meat and fat came from. So grass-fed and finished and fully pastured and all this kind of stuff. And all those things, as we know, are quite expensive. And so my argument would have been, well, you're going to save money and total health costs down the road, etc. But it never occurred to me that it's actually a cheaper way of eating than the standard American diet, that most people think that that's all they can afford to do. That's another peeve of mine. The idea that in order to be um, well, you have to be wealthy. And that's total BS. And so my friend who bought her a home in cash and makes maybe 20 grand a year and travels, by the way, all the time, is always traveling around the world to different places and whatever else, which most people don't think they can afford to do. She just, she doesn't waste money on stuff. And, you know, she eats this way and says it has saved her massive amounts of money. So I find myself sinking to one knee and I've got my hands clasped like this. And I'm like, will you please write a book? And will you please call it Primal Tightwad? And she went, okay. And so she did. And it's in a PDF now. She for years she was making the rounds, doing interviews and things like that, and it was fun for her. It wasn't really her primary vocation in life. She did it because I asked her to. And then her life has gone on to other things, and she said, "Here, Nora, I'm giving it to you." And that's like, well, I don't want to make money off of your book, because that didn't feel right to me. What I have done is I've made it available. So I'm on the board of the Price Pottinger Nutrition Foundation, and I've provided that PDF to the foundation, and they will provide it as a freebie, to anybody becoming a member, which is, I think, that feels good to me. But one of the things that she found, one of the brilliant things that she did, actually, she took a week's worth of menu from the standard American diet, realistic, stuff, your hamburger helpers, your ground beef, your your chips, your salsa, your, sodas and whatever else, your pizza nights and whatever have you, that standard American diet consumers consume. And she calculated down to the last penny what it costs for a month to eat that way for one person. Oh, not a month, a week, because it was a lot of work for her to do it. But she did it, and she calculated down, like, tablespoon of ketchup, 2 pennies or whatever. And then she took a week's worth of menu from the way of eating that I'm talking about, and she did the same calculations. And at the end of that week, not only was it cheaper to eat the way I'm talking about, it actually worked out to about $1,500 per person per year cheaper. So there's another nutrition for a new economy, And, when you're not having to buy, well, processed food, for starters, is pretty expensive. But also, if you're relying on carbohydrates as a primary source of fuel, you're going to be a lot more inclined to want a snack. You're going to be buying all kinds of stuff that really isn't serving you too well. Most of what is sold in grocery stores, which is all the center aisles, is stuff that probably you wouldn't be making much use of in my way of eating. And it's where, and also when it comes to the most expensive item on any grocery bill nowadays is the protein, right? You go out and try to buy a steak, God help you. It's expensive. However, if all you're consuming, like, when the person I'm living with and I, when we like have a steak dinner, we take a steak and we cut it in half and we each have half of it. And it's plenty. I mean, I'm telling you, I never walk away hungry after dinner, like, ever. When you're adapted to making, having those fat calories dominate your plate, fat is intrinsically satiating. And, you find that when you're eating that amount of protein that you require, but not exceeding that, even though, our, our eyes are bigger than our stomachs nowadays, and we want that big juicy steak. But when you realistically, if you're sitting down, you're enjoying your dinner, you're not wolfing it down, you're, whatever. By the end of the meal, you're fine. You're not bogged down. It's not that hard to digest, And, but you're saving huge amounts of money, on trying to buy protein in excess of what you actually need.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch the full episode. I'll see you over there.
I do believe in relying on ketones and free fatty acids as a primary source of fuel. I think we're well designed to do that. We've always selectively hunted the fattest, sassiest animals. What we have between our ears has an enormous metabolic demand.